Hi everyone, welcome to a new episode of EPG's podcast series. We're here today with my colleague Luciana Miu, the head of our clean economy team. Unfortunately, probably in her last podcast as a part of the EPG team, but hopefully we'll get you on again from your new position. What can I say? I must say you've done a fantastic job here at EPG. We're very lucky to have you. But I'm sure, your relationship with us will continue from your job as well.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Yeah, what we're going to discuss today is your favorite topic, I guess. Carbon capture, utilization and storage. At a moment at which we have this trend in Europe where we're seeing companies claiming that the regulations that are in place, that the conditions, the energy prices, everything that they're trying to face right now in Europe is burdensome, and they're seeking for some relief. Yet, this sometimes comes at odds with what we know that we need to do as part of Europe's transition, not just to an economy that emits less, but also one that's more resilient, that's more secure, that produces more affordable goods for European citizens and its companies. So it's a bit of a messy topic, not just the context in which we're discussing just climate change mitigation anymore. It's more considerations when it comes to things like carbon capture and storage. But it's a great time to discuss such topics. So maybe just let's try a bit to start from the very basics.
Yeah.
Which is, just to be on the same page, what is carbon capture and storage, carbon capture and utilization, CCS, CCUS, all that, and what's its main role in Europe's transition and the global transition towards a climate neutral economy?
Yeah, absolutely. So aside from being the thing that keeps me up at night, CCUS is really, it's an umbrella term. It's not a single technology, it is a portfolio of technologies, the basics of which are that we capture CO2, carbon dioxide, from point source emissions or directly from the atmosphere. We convert it to either a usable product or to a form which is then transportable for geological storage, permanent storage underground. So carbon capture and utilization is CCU. Carbon capture and storage, which involves the geological injection underground, is carbon capture and storage. And together we have this umbrella term of CCUS. You might also hear the term industrial carbon management, ICM, because there weren't enough acronyms in the European industrial transition bubble. And that is just a different term for CCUS, is industrial carbon management. So we have the idea of, we have point source emissions. These can be industrial installations, for example, like a cement producer or a waste incinerator, from which we capture the emissions, convert them to a usable product, or store them underground. Storage can be done onshore or offshore. So the projects that we currently have operational or close to operation in Europe all have offshore storage. So it's all storage under the seabed in the North Sea, but onshore storage is also possible as well. These are not new technologies. They've been developed and tested primarily in the US since sort of the 70s. For other reasons than for climate change mitigation. But now, especially in Europe, they're being explored more and more as a component of emissions of the transition of heavy industry towards low carbon. And I'm talking about industry in particular, because when we talk about heavy industry, we have emissions that are pretty much unavoidable or very hard to avoid. When we talk about the energy sector, combusting fossil fuels, we do have alternatives for that. You know, we have electrification, we have renewable energy, renewable heat production. When it comes to industrial processes, very often in the very chemistry of the process, you will have CO2 emissions. So if you remember from sort of basic high school chemistry, a chemical equation where you have plus CO2 on the right-hand side. And that is something that is unavoidable. And this is where carbon capture comes in as a potential technology to reduce those emissions, which are significant as well. In the cement industry, for example, about 2/3 of the emissions of a cement plant will be these inherent process emissions. Another reason that we're looking at CCUS is the idea that we will at some point need to have negative emissions. So we won't be able to reduce or capture everything to get to zero, to gross zero. That's why we're talking about net zero, which means that we need to balance any residual carbon dioxide emissions that we will still have in 2050 in the EU, where we have this target of net zero in 2050, with so-called negative emissions. So this mostly actually involves drawing down CO2 that's already in the atmosphere and storing it underground. So we have technologies for that as well. It's called direct air capture, where you have these gigantic fans, essentially, which are pulling in air and separating out the CO2, which then goes for underground storage. So you're reducing the amount of CO2 that's in the atmosphere. And you can also do it via biomass, because biomass in its life cycle, it pulls down CO2 from the atmosphere, which if you then use for production of bioenergy and capture the CO2 emissions, you're effectively keeping the carbon that the biomass drew down in its lifetime and putting it underground also. So these are the two sort of main, I would say, pathways for negative emissions. Yeah.
But a challenge to it is probably always economics, isn't it?
Yeah.
And especially with things like direct air capture.
Yeah.
That is very energy intensive.
Yeah.
And basically you need a high enough carbon price for that to make sense.
Yeah.
But I'm curious a bit about places, because you've made this distinction earlier between utilizations in areas that have alternatives and those that don't. Let's speak for a moment for those that do. So, for example, electricity production, which Europe still has a relatively diverse electricity mix, still a fair amount of coal production. And there's still some, even though we would have thought that would have gone past this moment at some point, that see CCS as a lifeline for things like CCS, for things like coal, for things like coal-based steel production, for a whole range of industrial production routes that are carbon intensive. And if you retrofit them with an installation that captures the CO2, pumps it underground, and then you get rid of the problem, does that make sense?
No. No, and it's been shown to not make sense. It's not an efficient use of the carbon capture technology. So there are technical differences between different types of emitters, and a big part of what makes carbon capture itself expensive is what is the actual concentration of carbon dioxide in the flue gas, right, that's coming out of these industrial installations. So you want to, if you're talking about sectors that have an alternative, you want to go, and you're talking about carbon capture as one of the solutions, you want to go towards sectors where you have a relatively high purity CO2 stream coming out of these installations. So you don't have to do so much separation from all the other gases. This isn't the case for coal. The highest sort of purity CO2 emissions we have are from ammonia production, from fertilizers. So their carbon capture, from a efficiency of capture point of view, is the one that makes the most sense. Coal is very low on the list. There's a great publication by E3G, not EPG, called the Carbon Capture and Storage Ladder, where they've ranked the different applications of CCS in terms of how efficient they are in contributing to climate change mitigation. Coal is right at the bottom, right? So a lifeline for continuing coal production, it's too expensive, it's too inefficient when you put it on coal. The lead times are extremely long. So if we're talking about how most countries in the EU have a coal phase-out plan, we have to remember that timelines for CCS projects are, if you're lucky, 6 to 8 years. And that's if you have infrastructure in place, it's if you have the regulatory framework up to date. So we're already getting towards the decades when we need to stop using coal power. I mean, you know, a lot of countries in Central and Eastern Europe have this plan. So what are we doing promising CCS as a way of continuing coal-fired power production when we don't have enough time left to actually implement it?
There's one more thing that we need to get out of the way before we get into the proper conversation, which is the safety of storing this underground. Because I think it's something that pops up occasionally in the public discourse, that it's something that's dangerous. Of course, with any industrial activity, there's some risks, but is this any more particularly dangerous than something else? And also about the permanence of the actual storage. So how sure are we that if we go through all these, this very intricate process of capturing and pumping the CO2 underground, do we know if it's going to stay there? Or is it just going to be just re-released into the atmosphere, and then we've gone through all this process, which is very energy intensive, without reducing emissions?
I mean, that is a great question, and I think there's a lot of sort of poo-pooing and dismissing of the safety concerns, which I don't think is fair. But what we know from the experience we have in the US and starting in Europe now is that it is safe. And there's a lot of sort of technical details as to how it's safe. Like when you pump the CO2 underground, there are, I think, about 4 different processes in place that actually keep it in one place. And over the long term, it does something called mineralization. So the CO2 actually combines with other minerals in the reservoir that you put it in and becomes essentially a rock, a solid, right? And this happens over geological timescales, but even up until then, we have various technical attributes of these reservoirs that need to be checked and need to be tested before you can then pump CO2 into them. One other thing to say is that there's two main types of geological storage sites that are suitable for CCS. One is saline aquifers, which are sedimentary formations. The other is depleted oil and gas reservoirs, right? So you've extracted gas or oil from an underground deposit, and you have space left, which you can inject CO2 into. The idea being that if for such a long time these deposits of oil and gas have stayed sealed and underground with no sort of fugitive emissions or leaks, then the same should apply for CO2. And there's been a lot of technical studies done on this, and the regulatory framework also makes sure that there's somebody liable for any leaks that might appear because of, poor management or so on. So it is very clearly stated in the EU's CCS directive who is responsible. So it's the storage site operator that's responsible for the whole duration when that site is being used to pump CO2 into it. They have to monitor it and address any leaks, immediately stop injection if anything is observed. And also for 20 years after the closure of the site. So even after you've stopped pumping down CO2 for 20 years, the storage site operator is responsible to continue monitoring that site, and then the state takes over the responsibility. So the idea that, okay, we've pumped CO2 into the ground, and okay, we've monitored, but then we've just left it, and bye-bye, that's also something that's addressed by the CCS directive. Saying that, obviously, it's a very technical thing. Like I've just given you a sort of surface explanation of it. Getting into the whole the geological characteristics and what actually make these sites properly sealed and so on. It's very, very technical, and I think that proper weight should be given to the public concerns around safety and around CO2 leaks. And a lot more is needed in sort of meaningful engagement to answer these questions, because the answer is quite complicated, the concern is quite straightforward. So we do need more dialogue in this sense as well. Yeah.
No, it makes perfect sense. And there's a lot of complicated engineering that goes into a process like this. And of course, it's always difficult to take that and put it into a sort of public discussion, but there's nuances to it, and I think that's probably what's important. But there's ways to do this safely and to ensure permanence to the greatest extent to which we're capable of doing that. Okay, so this is more about the general, what is CCUS, what it's for, how should it be used. Can you bring us up to date with what Europe is doing on this right now?
Yeah, so again, Europe started doing CCS relatively recently if you compare it to the US, but it started doing it for climate change mitigation purposes. So the first project in the 90s was in the Norwegian North Sea called Sleipner. And since then we've had a couple more projects, but not very many, take final investment decisions. The biggest one is the Northern Lights project, which is also Norwegian. So that involves capturing carbon CO2 emissions from a cement plant and a waste incinerator, transporting them via ship to the Norwegian North Sea and injecting them into the Norwegian continental shelf. And this has been a project in the making for quite a long time. It's kind of being watched as a sort of not necessarily best practice, but a good example of what it actually takes to make a CCS project happen. And it's expanded quite a bit. So it's now entered we've now got a decision also on phase 2, where Norway is actually going to be importing CO2 emissions from other countries, like other facilities have signed up to have to capture their emissions and have them stored in the Norwegian North Sea. And another project that recently took a final investment decision is in Netherlands, the Porthos project, which also involves offshore storage of industrial emissions in the Dutch North Sea. A lot of the activity has actually happened around the North Sea. There is a long-standing tradition of gas and oil exploration in the North Sea, so there's a lot of know-how in terms of engineering the subsurface, and there's a lot of industrial emitters on the sort of northwestern European coast that will need to capture their emissions. So it's become kind of a hot spot for operational CCS projects. But others have started to emerge in other parts of Europe as well. So the Mediterranean basin and even the Black Sea basin, like not a lot, but there is one project in Bulgaria that's looking to store CO2 under the Black Sea, and in the Mediterranean, Greece has put forward some projects as well. In Italy, these aren't operational yet, but they have received European funding, primarily under the Innovation Fund or the stamp of a project of common interest, whereby you have multiple member states that are involved in the same CCS project. And this is actually something that's quite interesting, is the cross-border aspect of it, because not all countries will have suitable storage sites, and some of them currently have bans in place to store at all on their territory, so they will rely on countries which are further ahead in developing storage to capture their emissions and ship them or transport them by pipeline to these countries. There's quite a lot emerging, again, around the North Sea, but also the Mediterranean is starting to potentially become a hub for this as well. So projects are happening, and the rate has accelerated a lot. Ever since, I would say, sort of 2020, 2021, there's been a relatively exponential increase in projects coming online and projects getting funded. Prior to that, you were mentioning the carbon price, and there was a bit of a dead decade up until the 2020s, which was primarily to do with that. There was a very, very low carbon price. So the signal to emitters that it might be cheaper to capture your emissions or reduce them in other ways, right? It applies to everything, wasn't strong enough to get them to invest in carbon capture. The EU was very enthusiastic and ambitious around the 2010s. There was even a fund that was put forward, which countries like Romania had signed up to do CCS projects with.
For coal power plants.
Yes, for coal power plants. Yes, yeah, the 2010s. What a cowboy world. But then that fund essentially disappeared when the carbon price crashed in the wake of the financial crisis and other various ETS-related issues. So after this sort of decade of non-action, we've now seen quite a big increase in the number of projects. Still, the rate is too slow to achieve what the European Union has set itself in terms of a net zero target, but also in its ICM strategy.
Yeah, but there's quite a lot of complexity, because you've got players and different sectors that need to coordinate on very complicated infrastructure projects.
Yeah.
And we may have put higher pressure now on emitters through the carbon price signals and the revision of the EU emissions trading system that was recently passed. But this never really solved the eternal chicken and egg problem of CCS, which is who moves first, those that supply storage facilities and make them available to emitters. Do you need the transport infrastructure to be in place to link storage sites to emitters? Does industry need to start investing in capturing the CO2 before they have certainty of where will it be pumped underground or used or whatever? But Europe has not just taken the pressure on emitters up a notch, but also now there's CO2 storage targets, right? Could you walk us a bit for that, and also what it means for a place like Romania, and especially for its oil and gas industry and history.
No, absolutely. So indeed there was this chicken and egg problem of, do I as an emitter take the risk of investing in this really expensive capture plant without knowing where or if I'm going to be able to actually do anything with it, store it, or convert it to something useful that somebody will buy. So the Net Zero Industry Act, which came out in 2024, it's a pretty wide-ranging regulation of the EU, so it covers a lot of different net zero technologies, which CCS is one of them. But Article 18 of this NZIA, to call it that for short, places a clear obligation on oil and gas producers in the EU to prepare CO2 storage sites by 2030 to reach a total capacity of injection ready, which means it's ready, it's set up, they can actually start pumping CO2 into it, of 50 million tons across the EU. And how these obligations are set is they are pro rata to the production volumes of the oil and gas operators. So the Netherlands is the country with the highest obligation. They have a lot of oil and gas production in the North Sea. The second country is Romania, because of the current oil and gas production we've had. It's calculated on a sort of baseline of the last 5 years, I think. So Romania, as what's become now a fairly major oil and gas producer, has some fairly hefty CO2 storage obligations to match as well. And these are primarily on Romgaz, the state-owned gas production company, and OMV Petrom. So they collectively have an obligation to develop 10 million tons of CO2 storage as Romanian oil and gas producers. Whether this is done on the territory of Romania or elsewhere, or they pay to have to own a share of an existing or future CO2 storage reservoir is a different question.
Or if they pay the fine for not doing it.
Or if they just pay the fine for not doing it. Fines which are not yet defined.
Exactly, yeah. No, but something that's, I mean, there is here a bit of a tension that's so visible, especially here in Romania, which is that, first of all, this is seen like a burden, like some as an unnecessary burden on the oil and gas producers, with some doubting the business case or the opportunity that might arise from carbon capture and storage for them. But also the timelines, because realistically, we're not going to have functional storage sites in Romania in 2030. It took the Norwegians 20 years to develop one. So how do we square that circle?
So indeed, 5 years from now, 2030, Romania, it's very unlikely, in my opinion, that we'll have 10 million tons of injection-ready CO2 storage capacity. Trying to renege on this obligation, in my opinion, is not a good idea. Of course, I think Romania can and probably should ask for a derogation, like an extension of the deadline, because there are a lot of things that we need to get in place before that. We don't yet have a proper CO2 storage atlas in Romania, so there's still not, I think, good enough, detailed enough information about where the storage is going to be most efficient to develop. The regulatory framework has been catching up quite well recently, but I think certain attributions, for example, monitoring of the transport of CO2 is a big missing link. But it's an opportunity for Romania, right? Like CCS is a business opportunity, and I know that you have some people rolling their eyes when they hear that, but it absolutely is. Like, we in Romania won't have enough CO2 emissions from the sort of targeted industrial emitters where it makes most sense to capture carbon to actually fill those 10 million tons. But that means that we can become a CO2 storage hub for neighboring countries as well, for countries which have even less geological storage capacity than we do, because we do have quite a decent amount of it. We can import those emissions and get paid for transporting and storing them. So it can give rise to a new industry, and especially in the context of Romania having a thriving oil and gas industry at the moment, but obviously with EU climate targets and so on, we are seeing a move towards other sources of energy. This is a business opportunity for the oil and gas sector. The know-how is highly transferable, the subsurface knowledge and engineering, highly transferable to CO2 storage from oil and gas production. You can be using the same reservoirs, right, that you've extracted oil and gas from for CO2 storage, and Romanian industry will need it. I mean, we do have a quite a significant cement industry, we have fertilizer production, right? And all of these emitters who have hard to abate or unavoidable emissions will need to store their CO2, to capture and store their CO2 somewhere. And the longer we leave it, I think the harder it's going to become and the more opportunities we're going to miss. Because even though Romania has among the highest geological storage capacities in Central and Eastern Europe, and so a good CCS potential, it is the only country in the region that does not have an innovation fund project on CCS. Bulgaria has one, right? Bulgaria, which is 6 million people, right? We are, and already the idea of a CCS hub is kind of being taken away a little bit from Romania towards Greece. So Greece have, I think, 3 at this stage CCS projects that have been funded, and they're already looking for the Prino storage basin to become an international storage hub, bring in the emissions from Bulgaria, from the Adriatic Sea, and then you have the Italians with the Ravenna hub. So this is something that is slipping away. We have countries in the region that have advanced further than Romania has, even though Romania has good potential and a significant obligation as well.
No, absolutely. And I could think at some point that will translate in a political signal.
Yeah.
It's still taking a bit of time.
Yeah.
Who knows? New government, new strategy, new way to approach things. But there are a couple of things that I think need to be mentioned because they have to be addressed. I think it's a long process, but first is, on the oil and gas producers side, which is I completely agree that this is a good business opportunity for them, especially when they could cover more than just Romania itself. But this is a bigger problem for them, I think, in general, which we're not discussing enough, particularly here in Romania, which is that things like CCS, hydrogen, renewables, none of this will probably ever be able to deliver the same type of margins oil and gas does.
Yeah.
So that's something for those companies to understand a bit how it fits with their strategy and the way they understand their profitability and profit margins and all that, because that's a challenge. It offers them options for continuing their activity and implementing their transition strategies, but it will lead to a company that's significantly different, also in terms of what it returns to its shareholders. And then is the public perception part, which is that there's still this view that CO2 is a waste, and you're importing that waste, which can trigger some quite sensitive areas among the wider public. And I'm going to use that as a segue to the ConsenCUS project, which covers that in part, but it's of course not the main point of this Horizon 2020 project. But this is coming to an end as well. It's something that EPG has been involved in for quite a few years. I think ever since you joined EPG as well. So could you please let us know a bit about what the project does, what its purpose is, and what it has achieved, and also how is it related to the issue of public acceptance?
Yeah, absolutely. So ConsenCUS, like you said, Horizon 2020, which has now been replaced by Horizon Europe. So it started quite a while ago. In 2021 is when it kicked off, which was about a month after I joined EPG. So indeed being thrown in at the deep end. It's a big project. So it has about 19 partners spread across Europe and also some from outside of Europe as well. And its main purpose is to demonstrate innovations in carbon capture, utilization and storage. A lot of the activity is technical development of a novel carbon capture methodology and utilization by converting captured CO2 into formic acid, which is a product with a wide variety of applications, supplied in de-icing, also in the food industry. So it's again a widely used project that could be made with captured CO2 rather than the conventional methods today. So a lot of the focus of the project was on developing these technologies and then also testing them. So there are 3 so-called demonstrator countries in ConsenCUS: Denmark, Greece, and Romania, where these technologies, once they were developed and tested in the lab, they were put into the sort of modular capture and conversion unit, which was taken to Denmark, then to Romania, then to Greece, and tested over the course of, I think, a month or 2 at each site to see how it performs, like how well does this technology perform at actually capturing the industrial emissions and converting to formic acid. And the industrial emitters were different as well. So we had a cement plant in Denmark, we had the OMV Petrom refinery in Romania, and a magnesite production plant in Greece, because the idea was that the project wanted to create capture and conversion solutions that are applicable to more than just one industry, because we are still kind of getting to the stage where we have these sort of off-the-shelf, modular and scalable capture and conversion solutions that any industry can buy, rather than it needing to be very customized, very tailor-made, and take a long time. There is quite a lot of work packages in the project, so it's not just about the capture and conversion. We've also had research on storage, the suitability of certain storage sites for CO2 storage. We at EPG have led some policy work as well. So how do you take such a large and technical project and translate its findings into actionable recommendations for policymakers about the direction that CCUS should go in Europe? And also public perception. So that is something that we, again, as EPG, were involved in. So we led a long-standing analysis of the narratives around CCUS in the 3 demonstrator countries, but also in other countries in the vicinity of these. Because if we're talking about cross-border projects, we might want to know what's happening in countries, in adjacent countries as well. So how will these countries feel about potentially importing or exporting their CO2 within a CCUS cluster? So since 2021, we have been monitoring media and institutional statements from 6 countries and from EU level as well on CCUS. And what we found so far is that CCUS is still a very niche topic. So even though I'm here talking a lot about how we have new projects and things are really moving, in the public discourse, it's still very niche. But it is increasing. So we've looked at these narratives since 2020 up to the end of 2024, and we've seen an increase in how much the media talks about CCUS, especially in Greece and in Romania. Denmark has a more advanced status when it comes to CCUS. They've been experimenting with this for longer. And their journalism tends to be much more sort of informative and balanced. So there hasn't been a massive change over the last few years. And most of the changes have been triggered by actual projects being developed. Whereas Greece and Romania are less advanced. But Greece is, as I was mentioning earlier, now had quite a few projects coming online, so the media and institutional narratives have also increased to match that. Whereas Romania is mostly talking about projects in other countries or about obligations coming to fruition in Romania, like the NZIA. Nothing actually happening at the moment in terms of sort of commercial scale CCS. So analyzing these narratives is important because it gives an idea of how CCUS is represented in these countries, and that will have an impact on how the public perceives it. If you have a media that is talking about CCUS as a savior of the industry with strong economic opportunities, not so much about climate and environment, but it will be what helps businesses transition and emitters stay afloat and so on, and then it ends up being really expensive and inefficient, then you have a problem, right? Because you've built up this idea of it. And one of the things that we've noticed is that in general with CCUS, there is a lot of what we call techno-optimism, that this is a technological solution that will solve our problems, right? Yeah. And this is, again, dangerous, right? So we need to be communicating CCUS in terms of the benefits, but also the costs. We need to be transparent about the risks. So again, no poo-pooing the safety concerns because they are relevant. So the risks, but also the mitigation measures, because we do have mitigation measures that we can put in place to make sure that CCUS delivers on what it promises. And that's one thing that is missing from the discourse, especially in Southeastern Europe. Denmark, again, being sort of more informative, more factual, tends to be quite good actually at presenting the pros and cons and having expert testimony from both sides of CCUS. But in countries like Romania and Greece, where you were mentioning, you know, the potential reaction to importing CO2 or to having it pumped underground, it is important that both the media and institutions take responsibility for the fact that this is complex, there is uncertainty around it, and it's not going to be easy to do, but it can bring benefits if it's done right.
But how, I'm also curious a bit about, you said this has been monitored since 2020, about how this media coverage has evolved.
Yeah.
And how did it change following some of these inflection points? The projects, which in some countries exist and some others don't, but also the Net Zero Industry Act and the storage obligation. I'm just curious whether narratives have changed to reflect this, or was it more sort of like a linear trajectory which just had a few more topics to add to an idea that was already forming?
No, it definitely has evolved, and I would say one of the biggest things that's triggered this evolution has been the overall shift, which I think is very perceivable at EU level, from just talking about climate change mitigation, need to reduce emissions, to also talking about competitiveness and how can the EU be competitive as a low carbon economy, because we are struggling in the EU, right? The Draghi report last year really pointed to that. So one of the first shifts we noticed was in Denmark. So around, I think, the sort of 2022 mark, the narratives around CCUS tended to become less climate and environment focused and started having more plots around economic security, employment. So there's things like an expression they used, a new adventure for the North Sea, because Denmark now has a commitment to phase out its fossil fuel exploration in the North Sea. So the idea that CCS is a new adventure, the North Sea is being reborn, and they even had interviews with employees from oil and gas companies talking about how this could be a new business opportunity for the Danish North Sea. And that has started becoming noticeable in Greece as well. And I think especially in the wake of things like the Clean Industrial Deal, which was only published in 2025, but there's a lot preceding it. Greece was also starting to talk about how CCS is important as an economic opportunity and as a way of protecting their industry, because we now have the phase out of free allowances for industry, and CCS is being portrayed in Greece as a way to keep these industries afloat. But also, interestingly, for them to become the producers of green industrial products. So Greek cement now being able to supply its consumers with green cement from which the CO2 has been captured. So these narratives have indeed evolved as I think the overall agenda has evolved. I mean, we've had so much happen in the last years, you know, the Russian invasion and everything else. So we are having a much more competitiveness-focused discussion, and this is reflected around CCS as well. I would say Romania is probably still the exception somewhat to that. And I think most of the reporting and most of the media reporting that we found has tended to focus on what's happening in other countries, and the things that have directly affected Romania, like the Net Zero Industry Act, have generally had a negative reaction. One exception, I would say, to it being internationally focused is that in March 2023, I believe, there was an attempt to explore potential storage sites in Argeș County in Romania. Which was picked up by a media outlet that I think had a bit of a target on the back of the producer that was involved in this, and basically released this so-called investigative report, very alarmist. That's, you know, they're trying to store CO2 here. They want to bury Romanian toxic gases. It was very, very clickbaity, very alarmist. But what essentially happened was that this was part of quite a significant community unrest, like the local community, which had not been properly engaged, right, in the lead up to exploring the storage site.
And it shows limits also when you have a reactionary approach, right, rather than being a bit more proactive, which I think is one of the good practice examples of the Danish.
Who have been engaging their public and their local communities, like you said, proactively, not waiting for it to hit a tipping point and then do damage control. I'm not saying that's easy to do, right? But it is something that, without doing it, risks abandonment of the project, which, as far as I know, is what ended up happening. Is that there were no more attempts in that particular area to explore the storage site. I might be wrong about that, but it's also not the first time this has happened in Romania, not with CCS, but with other types of subsurface activities like mining or fracking. We have had these reactions from the local communities, which have shown how important dialogue is. Not just dialogue, but a clear plan for how this will benefit the community as well. And if those are, say, too different from CCS, we have examples from Poland on CCS, the Bełchatów, also coal-fired power plant. The project ended up being abandoned because of social opposition. So we know these things. We know that there's a risk. We know that it's manifested in neighboring countries and countries across Europe, the Netherlands as well. And we have a way forward. It just needs to be, I think, implemented proactively. And another thing as well is what happened in Argeș County could have become an opportunity to start a public dialogue on CCS. It wasn't. Once this unrest emerged, once you had these very alarmist media reporting, there was a complete withdrawal of both the operator and the public institutions. This could have been an opportunity to say, okay, this is something that is scary, this is something that has not been properly explained. This is the chance to actually start talking about it and start taking these concerns seriously, responding to them as responsible authorities and future storage operators. But instead, you know, and again, I understand that you want to retreat from the public eye when there's something this volatile happening, and there were a lot of other factors as well that made put a target on this particular project. But unless we have this open public dialogue, this is just going to keep happening. And if we need to develop 10 million tons of CO2 storage in Romania, it's going to be 10 times that.
I think that's a very important lesson as a very important takeaway from this. But I think there's a second one as well, which is that project developers really need to think about what's the value proposition for the local communities as well, which is even if the engineering behind this is sound, even if the risks that exist can be mitigated, even if we don't operate in an environment with super toxic gases and all the other disinformation that's been floating around, there's some risks, which might be smaller than portrayed by some. But if there's no value proposition for the local community, of course there will always be opposition to it. So this needs to be factored into the project from the very beginning. And probably this will be easier to be done in areas where there's depleted oil and gas fields, because they're already used to that type of industrial activity in the area. And I think we've seen that in places like Croatia or even in the US in some areas. but it's something that needs to be factored in probably from the get-go.
Absolutely. And I just want to say one thing as well, that this idea of community benefits and returning the benefits of CCUS to those communities that are adjacent to it is something that I know the EU is starting to think about as well, about how to make sure that CCS projects do consider this, and what are the solutions as well, like what sort of models of community compensation or payback. And there's a lot of literature around this as well, like starting to look into what the best model is to reward communities that are taking, like potentially an almost zero risk of having this project, but still, non-zero, and accepting new industrial activity in their vicinity, right? So the thinking around that is evolving. I will say it also is highly dependent on the relationship between the community and the future storage site operator. So one of the reasons that Croatia is exploring, onshore oil, CCS is, yes, they do have a history, and they have the Hydrocarbon Agency of Croatia is also going to be responsible for overseeing CO2 storage. They also have a solid historic relationship with the communities in these areas. And I think this is one thing that needs to not be dismissed, is the historic presence of a potential CO2 storage operator, transport operator, what have you, in that community is going to dictate the perception that the community has on them, and by extent on CCS. This is something we also noticed in the narratives, that anti-CCUS articles, for example, because those do emerge as narratives increase, as projects emerge and the discussion starts to pick up in these countries. Anti-CCUS narratives also emerge more and more. And some of them put forward an anti-CCUS narrative directly in association with a particular company, right? They use whatever that company is doing as a hook, or not just company, like institution as well. Like the EU is forcing Romania to store 10 million tons of CO2, and then that association becomes formed between CCUS and a villain, right? An emitter that is already receiving a lot of tax breaks and so on, and now is getting money to also do CCS, to put it underground, sweep it under the rug. So I don't think that should be dismissed, the importance of these associations that become formed, because then whenever you hear CCUS, you think, oh, that oil and gas operator that has snuck around and bailed on some of its taxes and so on, and you have a pre-formed opinion of CCUS. Yeah.
Fantastic. Something I want to do a bit is also take a step back again and try to also focus on what are the learnings from a project like ConsenCUS, which we've spoken a lot about the public perception part and the media coverage of CCS and CCUS, but I'm also curious about what can we learn from an actual research and development project about Europe's more broader framework for RD&I.
Yeah.
EPG has published a paper on this recently as well. I'm just curious about what policymakers can take away from how this project has gone, and understand what tweaks need to be made going forward.
Yeah, so indeed we did publish 2 policy papers as part of this project. The second one came out about a month ago, and it's on the ConsenCUS website and our website. And as the second paper, being sort of close to the wrap-up of this project, it offered us a pretty good opportunity to look not just as, okay, what do policymakers need to do about CCUS, but also what they need to do to enable CCUS to be properly researched, developed, demonstrated in the EU. And it was important for us to focus on this again in the wake of the Draghi report, whereby, we know now that Europe has an innovation deficit, but one of the areas where it actually has a fair competitive advantage is CCS. There's more sort of innovation happening here in Europe than in other geographies. I think the main thing that we found is that there is a massive distinction between R&D, like what's happening in the lab, and demonstration. And right now, the EU frameworks for sort of R&D&I, they miss out that second D of demonstration. And a lot more funding needs to be mobilized for that, because, a lot more funding needs to be mobilized for it, in part because the scale of funding required to demonstrate something is orders of magnitude higher than, researching it and demonstrating it in a lab. And right now we don't have that. There are projects that are being funded with the expectation to demonstrate a technology, but essentially with an R&D budget. So a lot more funding needs to be mobilized to actually get these technologies out there, tested in real operational conditions, because you learn so much from this testing, like much more than the sort of innovation process itself. It's the demonstration process that gets you where you need to be in terms of then future deployment. And another thing is when you demonstrate, you will have so many unexpected challenges, right? Like you're taking a technology from DTU, from the labs in Denmark, and you're putting it into a cement plant, and then you're transporting it by truck to Romania on the Eastern European roads as well, and unloading it at the refinery. And you will have things that go wrong, right? And all of these are engineered out as part of the demonstration process. They offer so many learnings that we can take away. But if you're constrained by a project timeline and by a set of project indicators that are focused solely on performance, then you end up missing out quite a lot of that. So a flexibilization in general of the EU's R&D funding frameworks for projects to really reflect that we have the know-how, we have a set of promising carbon capture technologies that have been demonstrated at lab scale. Now we need to get them out and working in real operational conditions so that they can actually contribute to the EU's ICM ambitions, right? So I think those were the two main learnings from the project.
And it's definitely a place where the public sector has a role, because there's so many risks associated to a demonstrator, which you need something like a public entity to absorb. So I think this probably will need to factor into discussions of the future of the Innovation Fund, the future of Horizon Europe, all the negotiations that will be happening in the coming period.
Absolutely.
Right, as you know, we probably could speak about ConsenCUS and CCUS for a couple of hours and still not run out of topics to suggest, but our producer keeps looking at us, so I think we need to slowly wrap up. Just a sort of very open-ended question probably to bring this all together, which is, what are your parting thoughts about ConsenCUS as the project draws to a close, as we're trying to see what are the learnings from this and what it means for the particular stage at which we're at with carbon capture, utilization and storage in Europe, which you've already spoken about quite a bit.
Yeah, so it's been a really interesting project to be part of. It has been complex, it has been large, it has been long, but I think it's offered such a wide variety of learnings about capture, utilization, storage, public perception, policy, modeling as well. Like, there's a lot of work packages I haven't actually mentioned, which are part of this. And I think going forwards, one of the most important learnings is that we will need CCUS. We need to be smart about how we apply it, because this is expensive, it's complicated, it can make a significant contribution. I think it will make a significant contribution to net zero targets, but we need to apply it in a smart way. We need to target it at industries which need it the most. We need to cooperate between member states to develop cross-border infrastructure. We need to get regulation in place to make sure that all of this infrastructure is purpose-built with its own impact in mind as well. And I think that's the most important parting thought, is that this is new industrial activity. Capturing, converting into a chemical product, and then injecting underground, it's new industry. It has an impact as well. And we can't expect that CCS is just, I just take those emissions and just put them underground, and therefore I just put a minus sign on the emissions that I've put. No, because I need energy to operate the capture plant. Where is that energy coming from? I need energy for the injection facility. What kind of chemicals am I using to actually absorb the CO2? Like, how safe are they? Can I make them safer? So treating it as an industrial activity with its own impact, and making sure that we evaluate the emissions impact, the environmental impact across the full chain, from the moment you capture that molecule of CO2 to the moment it makes its way down into the subsurface or into a product, is going to be key. Because I think otherwise it risks becoming a silver bullet solution, which including, it can just help us keep coal going forever, and we don't have to think about the transition away from it. It's very, very risky. It risks undermining what is quite a promising solution for a very niche part of Europe's industry. So I think that is something that can be said about a lot of different solutions, right? Especially for industrial transformation. What makes sense where does it make sense to do something else or to not do it at all in the future? So being strategic, being tailored, and moving away from sort of big alarmist statements either in favor of or against CCUS. It's more complicated than we think, and we need to own that. So yeah.
Fantastic. I think that's a great way to wrap up our conversation. Thanks a lot for sitting down with us to discuss this today, and congratulations to the entire ConsenCUS team for all the fantastic work that's been done on this. Hope to continue this conversation with new exciting developments in Europe.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.